Okay, there aren't many creatives who confuse and irritate me as much as Ryan Murphy. Ryan Murphy may be one of the cleverest men in telly who keeps making the most mind-numbingly dumb shows and at worst puts his name to some of the most tasteless offensive slop of the 21st century. And he is clever. It's easy to criticise his work and we will be doing a lot of that in this video, but you can't deny he knows the industry. He co-created Glee, which was a huge success, and then immediately went on to create American Horror Story, another massive success that attracted household names. And you'll notice that a lot of his work is co-created, however I'd argue he's usually the main face, he's the brand of it all. He's also been attached to some great dramas based on true stories. American Crime Story captures his unique flair while still for the most part staying truthful to the story they're telling. Creative license was definitely used at points, but it never felt grotesque, fitting the story rather than attempting to capture the attention spans of Gen Zs. The first season of Feud, focusing on the bitter relationship between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, is one of my favourite shows he's ever made. He's done some naff things, but who hasn't? Especially with his insane work rate, there's gonna be some duds. But then there's Monster, the Netflix anthology series that depicts the events of a different killer each season. The latest season, Monster the Ed Gein Story, dropped on Netflix on the 3rd of October, and it may be one of the most tasteless pieces of television I've watched in a long time. And yes, I know Ryan Murphy isn't the main creator of this series, but it is his production company, his Netflix deal, and he would have had a lot of notes, and in my opinion he has as much to blame for this series as anyone else. This is Monster. Morals don't buy you Emmys. I will say at times this show looks good. It's filmed well for the most part. There's a few times when I think they're more obsessed with aesthetics than tact, but it does look good. The sprawling shots of the snow-covered farm are really well captured, the close-ups of hands and skin feel creepy without being too sensationalised. It looks good. There, a bit of praise, take what you can because there's not going to be much of it. Episode 1 mainly features Ed Gein's relationship with his mother Augusta, the death of his brother Henry, and the beginning of his crimes. This is probably the episode with the most potential. It's cluttered by the rubbish that will plague the whole series, but there is something here hidden beneath it. It's probably the quietest episode, where the dialogue is held back at times to allow the audience to sit in silence as we follow Ed Gein on his family farm. And this is good. Honestly, this should be really most of the show. Ed Gein was a loner, a man that lived with his mother who spent many of his days alone in his own company. There should be long scenes of silence throughout where we as the viewer just observe. The problem is, if you told this to the creators of the show, they would probably tell you that would be boring, and that's where nearly all of the problems begin. Within the first 3 minutes of episode 1, we see Ed Gein spying on a young girl in her underwear. Firstly, it isn't known that Ed Gein was a peeping Tom, however I don't mind this addition. Ed Gein was a man obsessed with bodies and skin, so this detail isn't too far of a stretch. Is it needed? Not really. I don't think you need to add anything to make Ed Gein creepy, but it's not offensive. But the issue, and it's an issue that plagues the whole of episode 1 and the entire series, is they're obsessed with making Ed Gein this weird, creepy horror villain, almost as if they're trying to compete with the horror characters he inspired. Barely anyone in this drama is treated like a real person, instead they are caricatures based on Wikipedia articles and what the writers think will make easy bingeable telly. Ed Gein isn't written or portrayed as a man who was known in the community, a man people would trust to babysit their children who would one day to their horror go on to murder at least 2 women, rob multiple graves and make furniture out of the bodies. Instead, he's portrayed as the bogeyman, the dark shadow that was always cast over the town way before he committed his crimes. The media dubbed Ed Gein the Ghoul of Plainfield after his crimes came to light, but the show decides to make that its entire character from the very first scene. And listen, this isn't me saying you should try humanise Ed Gein, however episode 8 goes way beyond that, but it shows me from the off that they are not interested in the true story, but only interested in one part of it: the horror. The facts are boring and the victims are necessary because they love the horror of it all. And speaking of facts, the show decides to ignore them from the very beginning. Halfway through episode 1, we watch as Ed Gein murders his brother Henry in a barn, starts a fire, and then convinces authorities that Henry's death was a tragic accident. Now, there has always been speculation over whether Ed Gein had any involvement in his brother's death, so the show tackling this part of the story makes perfect sense. However, it was never proven he did. There was always doubt. And 1, you can do this. Don't show the killing and instead cast that doubt over the audience, have us question the facts alongside the police officers because that's what happened. But 2, that's more interesting. The fact that so much is unknown about the case, a case that went on to inspire so many iconic moments in pop culture, is interesting. That's what the show should be focusing on. Do people care about the truth, or do they want the monster? That's a great thing to explore in a show like this, but they just refuse. Ed did it, and we move on. And Henry isn't a character in this either, by the way. He is the first real person who is in this show merely to die, but we'll get onto how this show treats victims later on, because honestly, gross doesn't cover it. Another major character we are introduced to in episode 1 is Adeline Watkins, another real person who once had a relationship with Ed Gein. Adeline may be the most confusing character in the whole show. Now, Little has known about the real woman. She once stated in an interview she had a relationship with Ed for 20 years and that she loved him. However, she would quickly go back on this, saying that the story had been blown out of proportion. And here's the thing. I'd argue this is where you can add a bit of creative license. You could almost explore both options, again focusing on how little is known about the very well publicised case. Or you delve into the psychological aspects. What does it do to a person when they find out that someone they thought they knew and trusted is found out to be the complete opposite? That's interesting, there's a story there to be told. However, Monsters Adeline is turned into a half femme fatale, half Lady Macbeth, who not only knows about his crimes, but goads him into it, helping him rob graves and taking photos of his victims. She isn't a real person in this, but instead an American Horror Story character who would probably be played by Emma Roberts. And this complete fictionalisation of the truth is there from the very beginning. We witness Adeline give Ed Gein photographs of a Nazi concentration camp, and suddenly his obsession with murder and bodies seems to begin. It almost feels like the show is trying to say if she had never given them those photographs, then he would never have gone on to commit his crimes. And look, you can probably tell already, I don't like this show, so maybe in my annoyance I'm reading this scene wrong, but I don't know how else it can be read. Especially when the show will later make her out to be his part-time accomplice. Adeline isn't his girlfriend in the show, she's not a victim, she's the devil on his shoulder, and I just think that's crass. And if you think that's bad enough, episode 2 opens with a scene that should be in Night of the Living Dead, but instead of zombies clawing at the door trying to get in, it's victims of the Holocaust. That sounds like a tongue-in-cheek way of describing it, and like I'm taking the piss, but I'm not. That is how the episode opens, and it is exactly that. Unmistakably a zombie scene. It has nothing to do with the true story they're supposedly telling, it barely has anything to do with the fictional story they are telling, it's just a cheap opening horror scene that would feel distasteful in an American Horror Story, let alone in a biographical retelling of a true crime. Because for some reason, Monster Season 3 has a whole subplot about the Nazis. There's been some theories over the years that Ed Gein may have been inspired by some of the horrible stories of the Holocaust, so again, featuring this in the story in some way makes sense. What doesn't make sense to me is to American Horror Story it, with multiple flashbacks and dream sequences depicting the atrocities. There is barely, if at all, any links towards World War II and Ed Gein's crimes, and there is no evidence to suggest that he was inspired by the crimes of Ilse Koch. Ilse Koch was a Nazi who was suspected to have created artifacts out of her victim's skin. Although prosecutors couldn't prove these crimes at court, she was sentenced to life for her role in the Nazi regime and died in prison. Now obviously there are some similarities there, but that's kind of as far as it goes, and yet so much time is dedicated to this subplot throughout the whole 8-episode run. And this is kind of the first of many subplots that feel forced in to try to fit the story over 8 episodes. Because the story of Ed Gein, although obviously horrible and dark, doesn't span a long time like most true stories that are adapted to the screen do. And like I said, due to him being such a loner, they have to invent so much, as if they're constantly worried about the show not being interesting enough. So the Nazi subplot comes and goes whenever they need to fill up 5 or 10 minutes of the script, and it's kinda gross to call it this, but the show treats it as filler. Another subplot / plot device that is introduced in this episode is the flash forwards to Hollywood creatives making art inspired by Gein's crimes. First up is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, the now iconic 1960s film that really reinvented the horror genre and gave birth to many of the tropes that we still see today in modern films and TV. Now, I adore Psycho. I think it is a brilliantly clever film with amazing performances and some of the smartest directing and editing choices ever brought to screen. So when this plot was first introduced, I was kind of excited. I thought we were about to delve into interesting territory, perhaps exploring how we as an audience are obsessed with the legacy and celebrity that is given to certain criminals, specifically killers. And I think the show tries to do this at points, but also it doesn't, not really, because instead it indulges in its own nonsense. Straight out the gate, Tom Hollander looks ridiculous as Alfred Hitchcock. He looks like a character from Little Britain. This is Alfred Hitchcock presents Little Britain. It is so dumb, but most importantly, I don't understand why the show is bothering to flash forward to this if it's going to change so many of the facts. Hitchcock was not obsessed with Ed Gein. Yes, he might have been interested. It wouldn't surprise me if he did a bit of research, but the show makes it out like Hitchcock wanted to make Ed Gein the movie, which just isn't true. He was excited by the book Psycho, by the twists, and by creating something that audiences weren't expecting. He refused to allow the cast to do any press interviews in fear that they would accidentally spoil the plot. This is a man that believed in this film from the beginning all the way to the end. Alfred Hitchcock did not delve deep into Ed Gein's crimes, nor was he affected by the man. He was just making a film. Also, the acts of his Psycho ruined Hitchcock's career, which is insane because his next film is The Birds, another one of his most iconic works. The only really interesting thing the show does with the character is show him as a peeping Tom himself. However, it still feels odd because the show doesn't want to explore the dark and horrible character that Hitchcock was, because this is the Ed Gein story, so we brush past it almost as quickly as they reveal it. If anything, they pedal back on this during episode 3, suddenly wanting us to feel sorry for him making Psycho. Honest, that's nuts. Why is this show trying to make out that Psycho was a bad move for Hitchcock? That is insane. However, the worst aspects of these scenes is the way the show portrays Anthony Perkins, the actor who played Norman Bates in the film Psycho. Every scene with Anthony Perkins feels more and more distasteful. The show goes out of its way, and again, I can't see any other way these scenes can be taken, but it goes out of its way to compare Perkins to Gein. Compares Perkins' secret homosexuality to Gein's own dark and sadistic secrets. At best, this is insulting, at worst, it is dangerous. This is so unnecessary, so pointless, it has nothing to say, and it's there for pure shock value. Also, this plot ends up with suggesting that Anthony Perkins being typecast as Norman Bates means he was forever attached and haunted by Ed Gein, and that is fucking weird. I'm sorry, but that is fucking weird. Episode 3, titled The Babysitter, is yet another 50 minutes that decides to depict theory as fact in the most over-sensationalised, revolting and gratuitous episode so far. For me to really explain just how insensitive this episode is, I first want to quickly explain the real case of the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley. Evelyn Hartley was a 14-year-old girl who went missing while babysitting a 20-month-old baby for her father's work colleague. After failing to call her father Richard as planned, Richard went round to the house to find the doors locked, radios on, and many things within the home scattered, before finding her shoes and broken glasses inside. Further investigation found evidence of a break-in from the basement, and they later found blood both inside and outside the house, indicating that a struggle took place. Her disappearance led to one of the biggest missing person searches in Wisconsin history. Police officers conducted lie detector tests on local schoolboys and questioned over 3,000 people in the first year of the investigation. Although her clothes were found in different locations, her remains were never recovered, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Once Ed Gein was arrested for his crimes, he was questioned about the disappearance of Evelyn, however denied any involvement. Her remains were never found at his home, and he was later cleared of any involvement in the case. Many years later, new evidence came to light that seemed to indicate who the perpetrators were, however no further developments seem to have risen since. Monster the Ed Gein Story doesn't just use a little creative license to tell this chapter, but instead completely fictionalizes it to turn it into a cheap and tacky 50-minute TV episode that makes American Horror Story look like pure class. Evelyn is played by singer and influencer Addison Rae and is portrayed as a young woman suffering from polio who Ed Gein killed due to her stealing his new babysitting job. She is first introduced as Charlie Hunnam's Ed Gein stalks her around town and has very little character development, barely used throughout the episode until the final few minutes, where she is tied to a chair in her underwear. The whole episode is stuffed full of horror cliches in an attempt to frighten the audience with none, with no care towards the real victim or the case. Honestly, this episode feels like it only exists so they can do the plot beat of Ed Gein babysitting children, and even that is blown out of all reality. As I said earlier, Ed Gein used to babysit some children in his town, and many townsfolk actually commented on him being good with children, with some saying he seemed to connect with kids much more easily than he ever did with adults. This is an interesting thing, both in terms of the true story, but also just as a plot beat in a drama alone. However, the creators of Monster used this as an excuse to get even more cheap scares into the show. He takes the kids to the house and begins to show them magic tricks with the body parts of his victims. It's almost a cartoon at this point. It's like any opportunity they get to do the most ridiculous horror trope imaginable, they take it and run with it, even if it goes against everything that is known about the true crime they are depicting. And I want to remind you that Evelyn Hartley was a 14-year-old girl, a child, a real child, and the ending of this episode is just morally bankrupt. Because as I stated, they have Addison Rae tied up to a chair in her underwear, and if that's not enough, we get close-ups of her chest and lips. The camera is far too aware that this is an attractive woman and seemingly oblivious to the horror it's depicting. But then, just to throw away any last little crumble of credibility the show has, they decide that she was murdered in the exact same way as a famous scene from the original film Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And this scene goes on and on. Ed wheels out a corpse, places a hammer in the corpse's hand and tries to get his mother to kill her, and this never happened. This is a fictional scene from Texas Chainsaw, and that's where the message of this show, if it's meant to be one at all, loses all meaning. Because Monster Season 3 seems to want to criticise and at the same time celebrate the horror movies that Ed Gein inspired. And again, criticising the legend that surrounds the case is a good idea for a drama. That is interesting, but if that's what you're going to do, and I think this is what they're trying to do at points, but it's so muddled so who knows anymore, you can't change the facts of those films. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was slightly inspired by Ed Gein, however once again, like Psycho, was not intended to be based on the real events that happened at the Gein family farm. The chainsaw, the family, the grandpa being too weak to kill, that is all fictional, totally made up. It is just a horror film. So the show is criticising, or at least trying to start discussion about stuff that never happened. And I'm sorry, that means what they're doing is worse. The films they feature in this show took a few aspects of a true story and made it into a new fictional tale. Monster takes those fictional tales and tries to morph it into the true story, while seemingly wanting to point the finger at those artists. If these films did in some way help create the legacy of Ed Gein's crimes, then Monster seems determined to cement it, to make him the first original horror villain. And it's at this point you have to ask yourself, why are they making this show in the first place? Which leads me very nicely into the next chapter of the video. There has been many conversations around the morality of true crime dramas, and these conversations have only gotten louder since the first season of Monster came out in 2022. Now there are some great articles online discussing this battle between moral and art, and yet I think even a lot of those fail to capture just how complicated of discussion it really is. Adapting true stories, especially true crime, isn't a new thing. Sure, there's definitely been a surge in popularity of the genre, what with streaming sites seeming to drop a new crime documentary every 2 minutes, but it's always been a popular form of entertainment. One of my favourite plays, Machinelle, first published and performed in 1928, was inspired by the case of Ruth Snyder, a young woman who murdered her husband. Her case grew traction due to a photographer capturing and publishing a photograph of her on the electric chair mid-execution. Now, although the play doesn't follow the true story beat for beat, there are a lot of similarities. The crime, the reasoning and the sentence all feature within the script. And I think it's a brilliant piece of theatre that captures the pressures women face and the double standards of men. It's nearly 100 years old, and yet it still feels incredibly powerful and relevant today. And it's not just theatre that gets it right, there's been some really powerful true crime dramas for the screen as well. ITV's recent I Fought the Law was a heart-wrenching 4-parter about one mum's battle for justice. The Sixth Commandment on the BBC told its story with extreme care, highlighting the loneliness that many older people feel and how some can abuse this for their own financial gain. And of course, last year's Mr Bates vs the Post Office had a massive effect in the UK, bringing the post office scandal to many people's attention for the first time. This drama was so successful that it reignited conversations about the scandal in Parliament and led to Paula Venables having her CBE revoked by the King. And there's many examples I could use. The People vs O.J. Simpson was an amazing drama that, while sometimes taking liberties with the truth, still managed to tell a raw and unflinching story about domestic violence, racism and the power of celebrity. The first season of Feud is a brilliant drama, depicting the making of whatever happened to Baby Jane, and again, while there are some creative license used, nearly all of it was in favour of telling the very real, very sad story of two women who were pitted against each other by the men in their industry. And I think the reason it's such a difficult conversation to have is because no one quite knows where you draw the line, what's okay to adapt and make and what's not. Titanic, one of the most successful films of all time, took a very real tragedy and turned it into a romance with two very attractive leads. Now, I am sure that some people would call this distasteful, while others would say it's long enough ago that it's not. So is it time related? Personally, I don't think so. Many dramas are made about recent cases and they're incredibly well crafted, balancing sensitivity for the case and the victims while still creating a piece of art to be consumed and enjoyed by its audience. Personally, and this is just my opinion, I think it's okay to tell true stories, even the darker ones, as long as you have a good reason for doing so. One day there will be a drama written about the multiple cases in the UK where policemen have abused their power and the cover-up that followed, and that is a story that's worth telling. That's a story that should never be forgotten. And remember, a lot of these men involved didn't even lose their jobs. And as we've seen from the post office drama, telly can be effective, and maybe one day more of those people will be held accountable. But that drama, when it is written, needs to be by someone who's passionate about it, who will do the research and wants to tell the story for the right reasons. The George Davis case is a true story that I have mapped out that one day I want to turn into a play. It's close to my heart and features themes such as class and family and abuse. And look, I don't want to tell that story in a traditional way. I'm going to have clowns and musical numbers, but it will have a raw honesty throughout about the system and how protesting isn't a luxury that the government should be allowed to give out, but instead a human right that they are currently threatening to take away. For me, it all comes down to why do you want to tell it? What's the reason you open your laptop and start typing? And I'm afraid Monster as a show seems interested in only one thing: popcorn Halloween viewing. They want the macabre and the darkness without any of the sensitivity that is needed to tell a story like that. And yet, I'm not surprised, because I don't think Monster wants to say anything at all. I think it wants views. I think it's on par with those who make true crime TikToks while dancing in the background, or get ready with me videos where they discuss the brutal killing of a family while applying foundation. There's a lot of talk about people being desensitized by these types of story, but this show is made for those people. It doesn't want to criticise that industry, it doesn't want to make an audience member feel uncomfortable or question yourself for watching. Instead, it wants you to press next episode while you're opening your snacks. It doesn't want to start a discussion, it wants to be #1 on Netflix. It doesn't want to question why men like Ed Gein or Jeffrey Dahmer exist. Instead, it wants to thank them for gifting them another grisly story and yet another Emmy nomination. Episode 4, titled Green, is yet another example of the show's complete lack of care towards victims. Green depicts the story of Ed Gein and Bernice Warden, a local woman who ran a hardware store who gets into a fast-moving sexual relationship with Gein. They go on some dates to the roller skating rink, and she gifts him her underwear before asking him to move in. However, after another mental episode where he talks to his deceased mother, Gein shoots and kills Bernice. When I say that barely any of this is based on actual fact, I mean barely anything, nothing actually. In real life, Ed Gein killed Bernice Warden and that's it. There was no friendship, certainly no sexual relationship, and the fact the show makes her into this very sexual woman who ultimately dies due to her relationship choices feels as if the creators didn't think the real woman was interesting enough to include without spicing up the story. I can't imagine how I would feel if a family member of mine was turned into a character like this for TV that is supposedly telling the true story of her death. Sick to my stomach doesn't cover it. There is just no excuse for this. This isn't creative license, this is fetishizing a story for your own financial gain. It is forcing a true person into the well-trodden horror trope that is, if you have sex, you die. It's gross. This episode is just a poorly paced piece of fan fiction that they've slapped the names of the real people onto to try and seem important. It's grim, it's grotesque, and it's cruel. So you can probably tell I don't like the show, so why did I watch it, outside of having to finish it to actually make this video? Well, I always try to watch the big stuff. There's a few things I need to catch up with. I still have not watched Succession, but I knew this would do big numbers on Netflix, and as a creative myself, that interests me. And also as a writer clawing my way into the industry, it's good for me to keep up with what's trending. So if you watch my other videos, you'll realise I rarely critique or slate something like I am in this video, and that's really for two reasons. One, I think as an artist you should be careful tearing down another person's work, definitely for some views on YouTube. Even when I talk about Chibnall or the recent seasons of Doctor Who, you'll see I try to balance that with some positives, or highlight the work of those creatives I do like. And secondly, and this is me being very honest, I don't think it's a good career move for someone who wants to work in the industry to start slating those who are already there. I think critique is fine, I think that's fair, even the biggest names say when something is bad, but pointless rants, not my style. Usually. Because it would be disingenuous of me to suggest I feel anything else for this show other than shock and kind of anger. Ryan Murphy and co can literally do anything, they've made it. Netflix will snap up whatever he offers. And for this to be the best they can do with all that money and the resources they have, is just a sad reflection on the industry. There are so many amazing writers who, given the chance, would have told the Ed Gein story with so much more care and wisdom. So I'm going to talk about it honestly. I'm going to say that it's bad because it is. It's worse than bad. It's just, oh. So is there anything good about this episode? Yeah, Leslie Manville. I think she does the best she can with the material she's given. She's always been a great actress, and that's evident here too. It's a shame she's in something so pathetic, but she is one thing I enjoyed. And when I say that, I mean the performance, not the character. The character should never have been written like this, but that's not on the actress. You'll notice I haven't spoken about Charlie Hunnam's performance yet, and that's because I've seen people rant and rave about him in this, and I don't get why. Sometimes he's American, sometimes he's Irish, sometimes he's wandered off the set of The Muppets. The voice, that fucking voice for 8 hours, and everything is said the same. It's quiet, and then it rises a little, and then it falls. Honestly, it sounds more like an impression of Sean Locke's impression of Michael Jackson.
You want cloud cream?
Just ridiculous. But yeah, this episode broke me. I just think it's evil, and it didn't need to be. Not much is known about Bernice Warden, and that's okay. You can use creative license to fill in the gaps, that's fine. It's just how you do it. If it was me, the episode would have opened with Bernice Warden leaving the shop for the evening, and the next 15 minutes you would watch basically a kitchen sink drama of her life. It would be just a basic drama full of heart, with characters that are flawed and troubled, but most importantly, real. We'd learn more about her relationship with her son, perhaps give a basic plot that, although it would be fictional, wouldn't be about something that would come across as offensive. To put it basically, we'd watch her life. And then, Right at the end, before the episode's plot can wrap up, Ed Gein would murder her, cutting her life and the story that's being told short. A fade to black and silent credits would roll, no dramatic music. If possible, I would ask Netflix to get rid of the automatic next episode feature, giving the opportunity to sit with what we've just watched for a minute. Because although, yeah, it would be fictional, it would feel real. It would make her a victim of a senseless crime, but most importantly, she wouldn't just be a victim, but a real person who lived and breathed and deserved respect. Episode 5 continues this season's tradition of just shitting over the facts to tell their own fucked up fanfiction. Episode 5 is called Ice, however easily could have been called Evil Adeline. This is the episode where the character becomes full-on Lady Macbeth, leading Gein on while goading him to commit vile acts against his victims. I'm gonna have to talk about this one carefully because otherwise the algorithm will hate it, but I think you know what I'm talking about when I say vile acts against the bodies he had in his home. Also, in this episode, Adeline murders someone, smirks after nearly every line of dialogue she is given, takes photos of the victims' bodies. It's full of ridiculous fiction, and once again I want to point out, Adeline Watkins, real person, who was never connected with being involved with Ed's crimes. Just such a baffling thing to add, and honestly, ignoring the fact that it's a true story for a second, it's also just really badly written. This character changes to fit whatever scene they want to put her in. Sometimes she's the scared victim who runs away screaming, other times she's this evil seductress who convinced Ed to take his crimes even further. There's no consistency, and that's because the show never knows what they want this character to be. This show doesn't know what it wants to be, it doesn't know what it wants to say. And this whole episode completely falls apart when you know that Adeline said she never had a sexual relationship with Ed, and Ed Gein himself said he never had a sexual experience in his life. So all of this is just a weird, messed up sex fantasy loosely based on real events. At every turn, this show, and definitely this episode, is obsessed with making the true story even worse, even weirder, darker and more horrifying. It's treating the events as plot devices, and when one isn't interesting enough, they turn that dial up to 11. All the while flashing forward to the movies the case loosely inspired and seemingly judging them for existing. But let's be honest here. The makers of this show adore those films. It's why they go out of their way to recreate the scenes from those films as factual elements of the case. Which, and this is a little tangent, but it's an important one. Every time they remake a famous scene from those films, it highlights that they are not as good filmmakers as the people they're imitating. In this series, we are treated to Monster's Psycho scene, where instead of Norman Bates, it's Ed Gein dressed as his mother as he kills Adeline in the shower. And this scene is full of nudity and gore. Nothing is left to the imagination, what is the complete opposite of the scene it's paying homage to. The shower scene in Psycho is one of the most famous moments in cinema, and to this day, young directors still study and analyse it. Because it's a brutal scene, it's full on and full of terror, and yet nearly every detail is left to the audience's imagination to fill in the gaps. There is no nudity, barely any blood, apart from the little bit we see go down the plug hole. Instead, it's just an incredibly well cut scene with a striking score, all of which comes together to create a truly unforgettable piece of cinema. And it's the same for the Texas Chainsaw and the Silence of the Lambs scenes later on. The Chainsaw Massacre scenes are lit dreadfully, with this orange glow that is attempting to recreate the style of the movie, but comes across like the opening of an advert for Thatcher's cider. And the Silence of the Lambs moment, while brief, is just a painfully empty shot that is none of the style or the atmosphere of the original. And as episode 5 plods along from one exaggeration to another, it becomes painfully obvious that the creators of this show are having too much fun. As I've stated before, I'm not saying this show shouldn't exist. I'm not saying they should shy away from the very real horror that is involved in the case. But I do think when telling a true story, I shouldn't be able to feel just how proud of themselves the writer is when another fucked up sequence is playing. Everything, even the moments of fact, have this edginess to them. I just feel like they're having the same amount of fun they had in the early AHS days, and that's wrong. Because American Horror Story, with all its darkness and weirdness, is also incredibly camp. And that's fine, that's almost part of the show's charm. Horror and camp have always been connected, so much that sometimes a film that's trying too hard to be genuinely scary accidentally teeters into being camp. I have no issue at all with camping up dark subjects to make a fun and pulpy horror show. But Monster can't be that. Monster should not at all be camp, because there's nothing camp about the story they're depicting. The second season of American Crime Story, which is all about the assassination of Versace, is incredibly camp at points, and yet that works because the whole show is about fashion and the dangerous obsession we have with celebrities. But the Ed Gein case needs to be completely stripped back, and actually probably its best sequences work when they allow the facts to just tell the story. In episode 6 we get the scene where the police officers search Ed Gein's farm and the truth of his crimes come out. This scene, bar a few odd dialogue choices, is actually pretty good because it's exactly what happened. They don't shy away from the truth, they don't indulge in it either, because the officers did later go on to call that farm the House of Horrors, so you've got to capture that. His home was full of lamps made of skin, bowls made of bone, he had body parts in boxes and some pinned up on the walls. Showing that is fine, and they captured the feeling these officers must have felt incredibly well at points. Also, I don't mind the change of Ed Gein being arrested at his home rather than at the supermarket. Him pulling up to the home while the officer's there works. It doesn't sensationalise the moment, but instead is a change that helps tell a more concise story. That's fine, that's how you should use creative license. But yeah, he gets arrested, his crime spree is over, and that's the end. Or at least it really, really should have been. I want to start this by saying, and this won't shock you by now, but nearly everything that happens in episodes 7 and 8 is pure fiction, so I'm not going to keep talking about that. Instead, I'm going to dive into why these fictional aspects don't work. First, because for some reason they gave themselves the Nazi subplot, they have to wrap it up. And the scene where he hallucinates a conversation with Ilse Koch and then her death scene is so long. It goes on for what feels like forever and feels incredibly odd because it's completely disjointed from the rest of the story. I also can't help but feel that we are given more time to get to know Ilse than we ever spend with any of the victims, which is just a fucking weird choice. But thematically it doesn't work either because it means nothing to the story. That's a different, very real story that needs a lot of care and sensitivity around it. But the golem coming for her at the end doesn't mean anything in this. None of the characters in the story are Jewish, apart from the background actors that are made into zombies at the beginning of episode 2. And hey, maybe some of the characters were Jewish and I just don't know, but that's still odd then because that's not what the story is focusing on. Also, the golem doesn't get her, she makes her own choice, she still has agency in her story right at the end. Honestly, the golem just feels like another excuse to do some creepy stuff with shadows rather than make any interesting point or meaningful statement. Another major issue with episode 7 is the killing of the nurse. As most of the events in episode 7 are hallucinations of Ed Gein, it's like the writers decided they could do whatever they wanted. We witness this nurse die in a very graphic and long scene. They give him the chainsaw again because they really, really want him to be Leatherface. And I have two major issues with this moment. First, they set this nurse up like a villain at the beginning, a woman that is shown as careless and evil and that the audience should almost be happy when she meets her comeuppance at the hands of a real killer that killed real innocent women. But secondly, I think you need to ask yourself, why did the creators add this moment of fiction in? And I think it's because they thought they had to. As the killings in this are nothing more than cheap Halloween tricks to scare the audience, I think they panicked. Now he's in prison and there's no more blood to be seen, no more violence against women to film. They invent it. They add it in, not to say anything important or profound, but to try to keep an audience invested. This scene could easily be subtitled, "Please don't get bored, here's another one." And I think that's gross. I wish I had something more profound to say about the show, but it's just gross. And this isn't me saying there should be no violence in this show, there has to be. In the true story, there was a lot of it. But you need to explore that in a careful way, with hopefully something to say about it. The one thing it can't be is just an excuse to scare your audience. That's grim. And finally, the last major thing I want to talk about in episode 7 is the conversation around trans people. Now let me start this by saying I am not the best person to talk about these themes. I am certain that there will be a lot of trans journalists and content creators who will talk about this series in a lot more detail and with a lot more knowledge than I will ever be able to. So please, go and search out those articles and videos, and if I come across any of them over the next few weeks, I will link them in the description below. So this is just my 2 cents, the opinions of a writer and a creative talking about another creative's work. I will say I am glad and relieved that this show does outrightly say that Ed Gein wasn't trans, because he wasn't. However, this happens in episode 7, and everything before it is in a reckless attempt to compare homosexuality or gender expression to the crimes of Ed Gein. It's fair to say that we are currently living in very difficult times, with many things such as identity being weaponised by the ever-growing violent political era we're in. Anything that wishes to explore trans people, gender or sexuality needs to be done in a more careful, sensitive way, and most importantly, must have something to say. I think Monster pretends it has something to say, but really it just wants to explore the macabre and use themes such as gender or queerness to try and push its horror tones further. And look, Ed Gein did make a skin suit. He did that, you can't cut that out. He was fascinated by women and their bodies, but he said it was to become his mother, to feel as close to her as possible. That is not a trans person. That is a man whose mental health and deluded obsessions led him to commit more and more depraved acts. So I think this scene, while I'm glad it is there, 1, comes too late in the runtime because this series doesn't need to be 8 episodes long, but 2, feels like damage control, and that is only needed because of the misguided and reckless scenes that came before it. But like I said, there is going to be a lot more knowledgeable people who will talk about this subject, so please do go and seek them out. Before we move on to the final episode, and trust me, it's fucking mind-numbing, I want to dive further into the Hollywood subplots and explore why Murphy and co may not be the best people to be pointing the finger. Here's a recent quote from Charlie Hunnam defending the series. Is the monster Ed Gein, who was abused and left in isolation and suffering from undiagnosed mental illness and went on and that manifested in some pretty horrendous ways? Or was the monster the legion of filmmakers that took inspiration from his life and sensationalised it to make entertainment and darken the American psyche in the process? He continued, is Ed Gein the monster of this show, or is Hitchcock the monster of the show? Or are we the monster of the show because we're watching it? You'll notice he never asks if they're the monsters for making it, but we'll ignore that for now. The idea of creating a show about the culture and industry that surrounds horrific cases is a great idea. To explore that idea by using some of the most famous award-winning films is another brilliant idea. And then finally, to turn that on the audience and have them judge themselves for watching, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. The issue is, Charlie Hunnam is describing a very different show to the one he's in. Because I don't know how he could say with a straight face that these filmmakers sensationalised the story while they are making a fictional film when you starred in a show that branded itself as the Ed Gein Story and yet desperately tried to make him into the original horror icon. And that is obvious. They go as far as to call the last episode of the season The Godfather. And let's be honest, Ryan Murphy and co have used so many real cases in their works. The issue with this is that the creative team seem to take no accountability that they have made a lot of money over the years adapting true cases for the small screen. And I'm not talking about American Crime Story or Monster at this point, but American Horror Story has countlessly used real serial killers within its seasons. And I'm not saying characters that were heavily inspired by, but the actual killer themselves as characters within the story. The main episode that comes to mind is Season 5's 4th episode titled Devil's Night, during which the ghosts of infamous American serial killers come together on Halloween night for a dinner party. Now I haven't seen this episode in a long time, so I can't criticise it too much, yet I do remember there being some jokes that obviously feel incredibly out of place. And I'm not even saying this idea is inherently wrong. Like I said, if your heart is in the right place and you think you have an interesting way to tell a story, you should go for it. I do think at times we put too many limitations on artists. However, if you are doing that, you have to accept that you are continuing the trend of making entertainment out of other people's pain. You cannot criticise the glorification of murderers when you yourself have been doing it for years. Norman Bates isn't a real person, neither is Leatherface or Buffalo Bill, but Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez and the Zodiac Killer are very real. And it wasn't Hitchcock or Hooper that put them round the table for a Halloween special, it was you. And how interesting would it have been if this series acknowledged this, if this series actually questioned the morality of its own creators? Honestly, that would have been fucking ballsy, and even if it didn't quite work, I would be making a very different video right now. Because hidden deep beneath the crass and the tasteless storytelling, there is an interesting topic to explore using the case of Ed Gein. If this show actually shined a light on the industry's obsession with bloodlust and tried to answer questions like, is it right to make things like this and why do audiences flock to see them, then I think we could have had a great show. If the overly gratuitous changes of fact were not just a way to make the story more interesting, but instead a commentary on how the myths and theories that surround famous cases become known as truth over time, that would be so interesting. Because I want this show to be fucking ballsy, to suddenly turn around and question the morals of its viewer. Ask the audience if after watching all these brutal acts if they can even remember the names of the victims. And most importantly, I want them to question themselves, because the show seems to act like it's better than everyone else when it's not. It's grosser and worse. But if that was the point, if that got switched on its head and instead became a bitter and harsh look at the current climate of today's industry, that could have been amazing and really harrowing and sad. But they're not going to do that, because they've been commissioned for Monster Season 4, so they're not going to look at themselves or judge their audience too harshly, because they need them to come back next year for another dose of camp pulp bloodshed with real people's names slammed on top to bring in the punters. Lastly, another quote from Charlie Hunnam in this interview. I never felt on set that we did anything gratuitous or for shock impact. It was all in order to try to tell this story as honestly as we could. Please remember this quote as we dive into the final episode of Monster Season 3. In the final episode, we watch as serial killer Ted Bundy tortures and murders 2 innocent women. Ted Bundy had no connection to Ed Gein, they never met, he wasn't inspired by his crimes. Nothing. Ted Bundy was an evil, twisted man who ruined the lives of many people. So of course Monster wants to use him, because with Ed Gein off the streets and hospital, they need some way of showing us yet more unnecessary violence. And that's what this is, 100%. I have sat here for a long time before writing this video trying to work out what else this plotline could be, and honestly I can't think of anything. Because episode 8 really can be split into 2 parts, the first part being a Mindhunter ripoff, and the second being Goodnight Mr. Gein, where we get to watch him go off into heaven after making his mother proud. So the first part is Mindhunter. They don't even try and hide it, but they also don't try and make any kind of critique of that show either, so it's really pointless. We watch as Ed Gein helps the detectives crack the case of Ted Bundy, and say it with me now, this never happened. And the show kinda tells us that. It's obvious it's all in his head, but then what's the fucking point? This isn't one hallucination scene, this is literally the main plot of the episode. We even have multiple scenes away from Ed Gein, where we watch the detectives try crack the case themselves. It's bad Tumblr fan fiction. It's literally, wouldn't it have been cool if Ed Gein at the end of his life managed to stop a murderer? Yeah, shame it didn't happen, let's write it anyway. And yet this episode tries to make out that it's profound, when instead it comes across as a parody of all their earlier works. There's no subtlety, there's no hidden message, it's just a way to get more crimes in the show without having to tell that story with care. Oh, and it's not just Ted Bundy by the way, this is the Avengers Endgame of serial killers. So many of them pop up in this episode, each one congratulating Ed Gein on his work. Honestly, it feels like the show is saying that if Ed Gein had never been born, then these people would never have committed the crimes they did. And I'm sorry, that's bullshit. People always want to blame someone else, but I don't for a second believe that reading about Ed Gein in the papers turned them into a monster. In the same way I don't believe playing video games turns you into a killer. And I'm not saying you're born evil, there is an interesting theme to explore in the nature versus nurture debate, but we don't get into it. It's just fiction after fiction, murderer after murderer giving Ed Gein his flowers. Because this episode, along with episode 7, tries to explore Ed Gein's mental health, to ask the question if it's ever as easy as calling someone a monster, is there a deeper root to the issue? And again, this is absolutely fine to explore, that could be really interesting. But I can't believe how much this show tries to get its audience to sympathise with him after treating the victims of his crime with so little care. You cannot, in the last 2 hours of your story, try to humanise the man you desperately wanted to make into an iconic horror villain for 6 episodes after the way you treated the people he killed with no respect. That's not just tasteless, that's worse. That is an insane choice, and how no one on the creative team went, hang on, this feels kind of evil, will never fail to amaze me. Because this episode ends 3 times, each one a kind of memorial for Ed Gein. The nurses and doctors dance around him, they clap and sing as they tell him well done. And some will say this is in his head, which yeah, obviously, but also we see all these nurses being really nice to him anyway. So what is this trying to say? The serial killers come in dancing, gloating about how many people they killed, and then, at the end, he sees his mother at the top of the stairs. He climbs the staircase and finally gets what he always wanted. His mother tells him she's proud of him. She literally says the line, he made something of the Gein name. And if you think that's the end, you're sadly mistaken. Because we then get a scene where some kid steals Ed Gein's grave, and I think this is what it's meant to represent, but the horror villains he inspired all come out like ghosts to protect it or are haunting it. And then Ed Gein's ghost is there as well, and he dances it once again with the chainsaw. How can you argue that these fictional films helped create a legacy for this man when you are doing exactly that 10 times worse? And that's still not the end, because we get one final shot of Ed sitting on the porch with his mother. It's incredibly bright, so I think it's meant to be heaven, and they look happy and smile. And that's it. That is finally the end. And after 8 episodes of them seemingly trying yet failing to criticise people turning these true stories into art to be consumed, Netflix cut to coming soon, Monster Season 4. Insane. Fucking insane. I never felt on set that we did anything gratuitous or for shock impact. It was all in order to try to tell this story as honestly as we could. So, what could it have been? Can you tell this story respectfully? Personally, yeah, I think you can. I also think you can at least try to. I don't want people to think I'm saying that true crime shows shouldn't exist, I just think you need to have more care with them and have something more to say than, look how fucked up this is. Personally, they should have cut out the crap. Cut the episode count down to 4 or 5 and just tell the truth as much as possible. Creative license can be used to help either the story flow or to give more information to the victims, but try to keep it real. Don't treat it like a horror movie, treat it like a drama that will probably scare most audiences anyway due to the nature of its topic. Or go ballsy with it, change things and do random stuff and gross stuff, but make that the point. Try and say something about the industry or the ever-growing genre of true crime. There are many problems with Monster Season 3, but one of its biggest issues is that it seems to think it's important. As if it's doing a good thing, tackling hard topics, and yet it just bulldozes through each one with nothing to say. And the weirdest thing is, it would have been so much less offensive to just create a fictional horror show inspired by the crimes of Gein, like the filmmakers they're criticising, than pretending you have the moral high ground. So yeah, some of the acting is good, some of the directing is good, but as a whole it's tasteless, insensitive drivel that has nothing to say or any point to prove other than the fact that morals don't win Emmys.